Hello everyone and welcome back. I'm Haddon, Programme Director for the IfG Academy here at the Institute for Government. And I'm very pleased to be able to chair this particular panel, not least because I get to ask the questions of all of my colleagues. From devolution to net zero, standards in public life to the future of regulation, we have an excellent panel of IfG experts to explore a range of key policy areas that this and future governments will need to focus on. Joining me on the panel today are my colleague Tim Durrant, who leads our Ministers programme and works with me on the IfG Academy, our Learning and Development wing. Gill Rutter is our Senior Fellow leading work on net zero, formerly running our Brexit programme. Yes, Brexit, we might mention that. And all-round experts on many aspects of government. Akash Paun oversees our devolution programme and was part of the expert panel advising the Independent Commission on the constitutional future of Wales, putting his expertise into practice. And Matthew Gill leads our public bodies programme, including a new programme of work that we have on regulation. So plenty of topics not yet covered today, and probably some topics that have been covered today that we will be talking about. I'm going to ask a few questions, or just a quick question round at the beginning, but I do want to get to all of your questions as quickly as possible. So please do, if you're watching online, start posting the questions on Slido. If you're in the room, please do get them ready. We will try to get through as many as possible. Tim, turning to you first. We were talking about it in the last session. Sorry, just my microphone. Both the government and Labour have pledged to do more to improve standards. How is that going?
So we know that the Prime Minister wanted to make a big deal out of this when he took over. You know, in his Downing Street speech, he said he would lead a government of integrity and accountability at every level. He wanted to mark the difference between himself and his predecessors. And I think we should give him some credit. I said this at Labour Party conference last year, and I wasn't very popular, but I do think Rishi Sunak has taken some important steps on this. He saw early on in his tenure a couple of high-profile ministerial resignations. He saw Dominic Raab and Nadeem Zahawi resign for different reasons, and I think Boris Johnson probably would have fought to keep those people in his cabinet. But Sunak said, OK, they've done wrong and they should go. He's also, last summer, published a report looking at how the government can improve standards. And while there were some things that they didn't say they would do, most notably giving the Independent Advisor on Ministerial Interest the ability to start an investigation without the PM's permission, there were lots of steps, particularly enforcing rules on what ministers and civil servants can do after they leave government. So the Conservatives have made some positive steps. Labour have made a big deal of this over the last couple of years, and formerly Angela Rayner, now Nick Thomas-Symonds, are committed to this idea of an independent integrity and ethics commission, which will take over some of the regulators in this space. That is still quite thin on detail. We don't know exactly how that's going to work, but we do expect that they want to make that change early on if they do get into government. So I think what's interesting on this space is it's actually a bit of differentiation between the parties, and it's not really sort of top ticket item in terms of the election campaign, but we are seeing a difference of approach. The question is, will Labour flesh out details before the election? Will the Conservatives talk about this anymore, or is what they published last summer just the end of the road for this?
Brilliant, nice rattle through. I'm sure there will be others in the audience who've got more questions about that particular agenda. But first of all, Gill, net zero, how big an issue do you think that will be at the election?
I think it might be quite a big issue because what we're starting to see is sort of battle lines being drawn on net zero. But actually, rather than focus on what's going on at the election, I just want to focus on what's going on right now, because I think we're in a really quite interesting position. With the Prime Minister, you know, after the ULEZ by-election success, of course, ULEZ, as you all know, isn't about net zero really, but took the message that there were votes to be had in taking what he described as a pragmatic and proportionate approach to net zero, making sure that he was sensible about the costs. And actually, he's switched the rhetoric quite a lot on net zero, much more sceptical than we've heard from UK Prime Ministers before. And he's done some, you know, we might say, quite misguided performative things, like the oil and gas licensing bill that had its second reading finally on Monday.
You were a bit more critical than that in the...
I was a bit more critical. I mean, you know, sort of... But what's really interesting is actually the government is actually doing quite a lot of quite sensible things. It sort of actually stuck to quite a lot of things it said it would do. It introduced quite a lot of sensible measures, which it did on the 18th of December, which is usually sort of take out the trash day, but this was actually hide your green announcements day, which was quite interesting. And I've looked at all this and sort of thought, this is really weird, because normally we talk about rhetoric action gaps in the other direction. And so I was talking last week to Chris Stark, who's the Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee, outgoing Chief Executive. If any of you want a job, it's a great job, do apply. And Chris said he'd actually called this green hushing, where the government, rather than greenwashing, which we've got used to, was actually just being very, very quiet on the good stuff it was doing, and actually being quite noisy about the more stuff that might appeal to members of the net zero scrutiny group. So I think that's really interesting on the Conservative side. On the Labour side, we have this continual question. In different times, they committed to this 28 billion a year. That has now become 28 billion towards the end of the Parliament. The 28 billion isn't 28 billion, because actually it's on top of what the Conservatives are doing. Net that off, gets nearer to 20 billion, etc., etc. And we keep on being told it's only when the fiscal rules allow. And we all know that depending on what Jeremy Hunt does in a number of budgets, there may not be very much fiscal headroom at all, particularly when you think of other demands. So I think it's really difficult. And Labour is now focusing down very much. We heard from Nick Thomas-Symonds on this mission, which is now about powering up Great British Energy, which in a sense is the sort of vaguest part of the plans, actually. It'd be more sensible just to say we're doing all these other things rather than just say we're going to focus on something that frankly won't come into being for a couple of years when you think about legislation. So I think it's really interesting that I think we might hear quite distant rhetoric, and actually in terms of actions, two parties are not that far apart.
Okay, brilliant. Akash, I've already done a couple of big issues. Another one, English devolution. What are some of the differences between Labour and the Conservatives on that?
Well, I mean, even before we get to the general election, of course, we're going to have quite a big year for English devolution. So in May, we've got 10 Metro Mayor elections taking place. So I think that's going to be a really big moment, actually, at which to assess the success of devolution so far and the extent to which it's become embedded, and these Metro Mayoral posts have become embedded as important players at the local and regional level. So, I'll be keeping an eye on turnout, and also be interesting to see, whether voters are starting to judge and vote for mayors based on their own records rather than just through the prism of party labels. So might the Conservative incumbent mayors get dragged down by their party label, or will voters kind of judge them in terms of their own records? So that's going to be really interesting. And then meanwhile, I mean, this is an area, maybe quite a rare one, where, I mean, the government does have actually a sort of reasonable story in terms of achievement since 2019, the additional devolution deals they've concluded, and it's indeed still got an active agenda implementing a load of those deals. So we've got the Trailblazer deals being put into practice next year in Greater Manchester and West Midlands, new deals coming on stream, well, 3 new ones this May, a few more next year too. So it's quite interesting. I mean, this is going to be an area where right up to and beyond the general election, the government, DLUC as the lead department, are going to be quite busy just concluding and implementing what they've already achieved. To come on to the general election though, I mean, this is an area where, it's quite striking the extent to which there aren't big differences actually between what we've heard from Labour and what the government have been talking about for the last few years. I mean, both parties want to complete the map of English devolution, to extend devolution to the 50% or so of the country that's been left out so far. They both want to build on the existing institutions, deepen the powers of the existing mayors in various places. And we might start to see a bit of a sort of narcissism of small differences, because as an opposition, you probably don't want to be campaigning on the basis that, good job, Michael Gove, you'll see more of the same from us. Probably from an IfG perspective, we'll be quite, pleased to see a government that doesn't try and rip things up and reinvent the wheel. But yeah, I mean, it seems like there's going to be quite a lot of continuity. I mean, there might be a few points of difference, though. I mean, Labour has promised this Take Back Control bill. haven't seen much in terms of detail of what that might do, but from what we understand, the idea might be to create more of a consistent framework, more of a transparent process by which places can bid for and draw down powers from Whitehall.
An IfG recommendation?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, similar to things we've certainly recommended over the past couple of years. And I think that would be welcome. Yeah, I mean, it would put that whole process on a more transparent footing rather than what we've tended to see in the past, which is decisions taken in a pretty opaque way, frankly, about which deals ministers want to prioritise, what powers are on the table. So I think that's one area. And then just finally, I mean, I think there's a possibility that we might see Labour start to broaden the devolution offer. It's been very much economic focused thus far, but if you look at what quite a few of the big Labour mayors have tried to do, they've tried to they set objectives that go way beyond just productivity and job creation and so on, and they want to be judged on broader social and health and environmental outcomes, but they don't really have many of the levers to do that, although in places like Greater Manchester, that is starting to change. But I think there's an opportunity and a possibility that we'll see Labour take a kind of broader conception of what devolution is for and make a kind of broader set of powers available.
Okay, brilliant. Matthew, bringing it back to something a bit more topical, 2024 started with a big focus on the scandal of Post Office Horizon convictions. What lessons should we take from that about the way government manages its public bodies?
Interesting. I mean, I guess the first and obvious lesson is don't start from here. This has been going for a very long time, and when you're in a situation of having to pass emergency legislation to overturn convictions, this is not where anybody would have wanted to be. I think if you're interested in public bodies, this case study has it all, ranging from the role of ministers and the extent to which they should have spotted things earlier, the role of civil servants and what their responsibilities are to see the patterns emerging in this case, then going down through all sorts of layers of complexity with respect to the way the post office was organised. There was a lot of exceptionality over the period in which the convictions were happening in terms of the privatisation of Royal Mail, in terms of the movement of regulation from Postcom into Ofcom, but also a lot of the usual complexity you have around public bodies in terms of the differentiation of responsibility between the CEO and the board and the shareholder executive overseeing the organisation from government and the civil servants, and how all of that mapped together. So one of the lessons is this is incredibly complex, and for an issue that dragged on for many years, that complexity is overlaid by the churn of personnel within each of those posts and positions. And so trying to work your way through that is really important. In this case, it layers on also the issues around government procurement and how to manage contracts, and issues around reliance on technology and whether you can actually assume that what the computer tells you is correct. So lots of different lessons learned here. I think the lessons that I would draw from a public bodies perspective, looking at the institutional complexity around it, are really both clarifying accountability as far as possible so that it's clear who is responsible for what decisions at which time, but more making sure that when somebody spots a problem, they know what to do about it and feel empowered to do that. In the case of ministers and civil servants, that's, well, once 2 or 3 people have told you something, you might think it's a bit odd, but once 10 or 12 or 15 people tell you something, what do you then do and how you act on it? For people in an organisation, it's, does the whistleblowing process really work? Do people really feel empowered to use that and to say what they see and know that they're going to be heard and not going to be hounded for that, even in the private organisations like Fujitsu dealing with this as well as within government. And in terms of the civil service as well, what is the incentive not just to spot what's going on, but to actually grip it? With those number of actors in the system, it's very easy to assume that somebody else is going to spot what the problem is and somebody else is going to deal with it. And so there needs to be a positive incentive and recognition for people who actually spot the problem and take it forward.
All right, thank you. Gill, I'm afraid I've already got an online question for you, which is the question I was about to ask you anyway. It is from Hannah White. Thank you. Hannah White. What does Gill think the prospects are for the restoration of power sharing in Northern Ireland, and what should the government be doing?
Thanks, Hannah. Is this going to feature in your podcast later? Well, it's really quite interesting because I've just written a blog which is now going to go into the blog graveyard, which was basically on the assumption that Chris Heaton-Harris would introduce a bill to basically postpone the Northern Ireland elections to beyond the next UK general election, which I thought was probably very likely to happen because, just to work on the assumption that power sharing wasn't going to come back, and join the chorus of people all saying, well, Northern Ireland meant to have a government, but you can't leave the place completely ungoverned for another year till the election. So you need to actually work out how you're going to make some decisions here, because it's not fair to inflict the failures of politicians on both sides of the Irish Sea on the long-suffering citizenry of Northern Ireland. But fascinatingly, Chris Heaton-Harris has announced he's going to legislate, but only to prolong for 2 weeks, which gets him out of his statutory obligation, which expired last Thursday, to call elections immediately, which he hasn't done and doesn't seem to be ending up in court. So that suggests, because he's going to have to bring forward another bill if that one expires, that suggests that he does think there's some really realistic prospect of the DUP coming back, or is turning up the heat for one last time before he has to flick over to his plan B. But I think none of this should detract from actually the scale of the problems that are facing whoever comes back into government in Northern Ireland. The problem is the need for a government becomes more urgent, and the attractiveness of going into government becomes progressively less attractive, because the in-tray of problems is just mounting as Northern Ireland, public services, worst performers, nobody's had any pay increases because the civil service doesn't feel empowered to grant pay. They had that massive public sector strike last Thursday. And the amounts of money that are being talked about to restore Northern Ireland public finances, we hear a figure of 3.3 billion, I think that's quite big. To put that into England relative terms, multiplied by 30, and then you realise you're talking quite serious money, which effectively is what the UK is saying has gone missing to stabilise public finances in Northern Ireland. So I think it's good. It would be very good if the government could take 2 weeks and actually focus on getting government in Northern Ireland really back up and running, back on track. And then I think it needs to start looking longer term at the institutions. There was some suggestion that came forward from the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. Akash may want to comment on this, about changing some of the institutions to make them less vulnerable, because since Brexit, Northern Ireland's been without a government for much longer than it's had a government.
Yeah, Akash, on that, and I mean the union more generally, we haven't really touched upon it today.
Oh, sure. Well, yeah, I mean, just first then on Northern Ireland, I think, Gill's kind of explained very clearly the current political context. And the assumption has to be that they're quite close to getting a deal, or that's the view in the Northern Ireland office. But even if we do get power sharing up and running, yes, how long is it going to last this time? What will be the next crisis that strikes it? History tells us there will be another one coming down the line, unfortunately. And I do think that it's obviously going to be welcome if the parties are persuaded to go back into the executive together. But at some point, we are going to have to confront, I think, the question of whether the settlement as it exists is sustainable for the long run. So yes, the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee have made recommendations, so have lots of other people. The Alliance Party have been very strong on this, as you'd expect, because as it stands, you have this very odd situation in law that means that if, which is not an impossibility at all, the Alliance Party were to come second at a future Assembly election, they would not be entitled to take up the post of Deputy First Minister, although bizarrely, if they came first, they would be entitled to take up the post of First Minister, which is some weird stitch-up in the St Andrews Agreement, when it was never thought as possible that anyone other than unionist and nationalist parties would dominate. So you've got this settlement that at some point just might suffer this severe legitimacy crisis when a party that may overtake, say, the DUP, is excluded from the top job. So is there a route over time by which Northern Ireland can become something more like a normal parliamentary democracy where elections determine which parties form the government, which is how normally these things work, I think. So who knows? Over time, I think we might get there. I mean, just quickly, you asked about the union. That's obviously a big question. I mean, I think, on Scotland, the SNP is still going to try and make this an independence election. The SNP passed a motion saying that's going to be line 1 of the manifesto. They're going to claim if the SNP win a majority of seats, because they definitely won't win a majority of votes. They'll struggle to win a majority of seats. But if they win a majority of seats, they're going to claim that's a mandate to enter negotiations. UK government can quite easily ignore that. So I think just quickly, because there's loads of stuff we could get into. Yeah. I think there is a risk that an incoming government, whichever party, but let's think about the Labour scenario, having won a load of seats in Scotland, probably done quite well in Wales as well, comes in and is a bit complacent, basically, that this issue is settled. Because the reality is that Scottish voters don't see independence as a top issue at the moment. It's dropped down the order in terms of salience. So you're going to have a lot of pro-independence voters who will vote Labour. But ultimately, underlying that, around 50% of Scottish voters still say they'd vote yes in another independence referendum. And it's a much bigger bit, it's a very clear majority among younger voters. And I say younger, I think anyone below the age of about 50, there's a majority in favour of yes. So the long-term constitutional issue is not settled. And I think an incoming government should think about that and what is its strategy to strengthen and secure the union. Not to mention the debate in Wales that.
Well, I'll come back to Wales because I've got a question coming in, so I'll come back to you on that in a minute, give you a break for a moment. Tim, I'm not going to ask you about Nicola Sturgeon's DMs and WhatsApps and so forth. Earlier today, Kwasi Kwarteng in our panel conceded we'd had too many housing ministers, which is some progress, but said it was a consequence of the political turmoil of recent years. Do you think that's a fair excuse?
I think that's part of the picture. Obviously, we have seen not just 16 housing ministers in 12 years or however many it is, but 5 PMs, 5 education secretaries in 1 year, etc., etc. There's been a huge amount of turnover, partly because of political events, political turmoil, but partly also because it's kind of become expected. People expect to be moved around. There's a hope among journalists that there'll be a reshuffle soon because it gives them something to talk about. And I think there's this whole kind of sugar rush approach to government in the last few years, which has actually become quite damaging. John Glenn said in his event earlier today that it was only one person who could choose when ministers move, the Prime Minister. That is strictly true, but there have been ministers who said, actually, no, Prime Minister, I think it's better if I stay in post. Jeremy Hunt asked to be held on as Health Secretary under Theresa May because he thought there was unfinished business in the Department of Health. And I think if more ministers, it's harder, obviously, if you're not as senior as that, and perhaps if you have a Prime Minister who is more secure in their position than Theresa May was at that point. But if more ministers sort of focused on what can I achieve in this role, how can I get things done here, rather than always looking for the next advancement, I think that would be helpful. And it would be interesting to see, the Prime Minister was asked, I think yesterday or over the weekend, whether or not Jeremy Hunt would still be Chancellor at the election. It took him a couple of goes to confirm that. We very much hope that he will be, not out of party allegiance, but because stability in Chancellors is a good thing, generally. We hope that ministers will do the same. And I think it'll be interesting to see what approach Labour take. They've set up their team. If they get into government, will they carry across the same people into the same roles? Generally speaking, we think that makes sense because those people will at least know the issue, even if they're getting up to speed with how the department works.
You could argue, though, Tim, that Jeremy Hunt has been 2 chancellors in one chancellorship. There was the sort of, the recovery stable, rebuild the public finances chancellor we saw when he first came in, and then we flipped to the election winning, tax cutting, giveaway chancellor. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a change of person for it to be that obviously sometimes to have quite a radical shift of policy.
Whole nother debate. Okay, I'm going to turn to the room now. So please do stick your hands up if you've got a question for the panel. I'm looking around.
No questions. We're going to have to
we've got a couple here. So somebody at the front and then behind. At the front first. And if you could say who you are, just for the people watching at home.
Graham Pendlebury, former senior civil servant in the Department for Transport. I was listening to Kwasi Kwarteng this morning. I thought it was very thoughtful and insightful. But he said one thing that is undoubtedly true, but I still found quite shocking when he said that looking at the forthcoming budget, the Chancellor's principal sort of goal, I'm paraphrasing him here, will be to make sure he could balance out the competing interests within the different wings of the Conservative Party. He didn't say he would be taking decisions that were in the best long-term interests of the British economy and the British people. And I thought therein lay, and I'm sure he was being rather honest, if a little, incautious in saying that. But I wondered if you had any comments on that, because isn't that part of the problem that we seem to have, that decisions are taken on those kind of narrow sectoral interests rather than thinking about what is the broader interest of the nation and the people?
Yeah, great question. We do have thoughts on long-term policy challenges. We'll come back to that then at the back, and then another one over here. Thank you.
Thanks. Alex Thomas from the IfG. What would the election of Donald Trump mean for the British government?
Excellent questions.
A good IfG question. I wondered...
David, can you just say...
Sorry, David Halpern, Paper Insights team, Nudge Unit, number 10's in here. Whether you think what the IfG view is how ready the opposition is for a change of government, given that the IfG was just set up when we did the last one, and how was IfG done, or access arrangements, all the rest of it? How ready are they?
We just had a report out on that, David. I can come back to that in a minute.
Definitely a question for you.
Yeah, I know. I'm supposed to be just chairing. Jill, do you want to tackle the question about chancellors and thinking about the long term?
Yes, I mean, election year is never good for long-term economic policy making. I mean, you just sort of, have to cross your fingers and hope we can get through with relatively, minimum damage to public finance. I think it really would be a shame if the government frames its economic decision making this year into how can we make, if there's a change of government, how can we make their first year as difficult as possible with a view to making them a one-term government. I think that's not in the public interest. I think, Kwasi Kwarteng probably was just giving us an insight into the day-to-day nightmare of trying to be a relatively sort of sensible minister operating in a very divided and factionalised party. And I think one of the really interesting, if you like, legacies of Brexit is how the Conservative Party has, if you like, sort of dissolved into this competing factionalism, which we haven't really seen on anything quite like this scale before, where policy manoeuvring has to be negotiated massively between lots and lots of people whose primary identification, maybe the fault of WhatsApp looks at Tim, who writes about WhatsApp a lot, but maybe the fault of WhatsApp who identify with the groups they're members of rather than with the party, rather with the whips. Quite a lot of people, I think that part of this is due to the poor socialisation of members who spent very little time in Parliament for their first year and a half because of the impact of the COVID pandemic. It'll be very interesting to see if we have an influx of new MPs next election, which looks like we will under any scenario, how the whips go about ensuring that that parties are a bit more disciplined coming forward. But and I think as others said, as Giles said in his section, fewer fiscal events are better. And if you want one of the most depressing insights into UK tax policy making, can I commend the George Osborne and Ed Balls podcast, which I listened to despite myself and really quite like, where they discuss the pressures on Jeremy Hunt to be a very political chancellor and talk about how he needs to frame it, needs to have more fiscal events, and how crashingly naive Rachel Reeves is for thinking that there would be merit in one fiscal event a year. I have to say, IfG on Team Reeves on this one, rather than on Team has-been ex-chancellors and ex-shadow chancellors.
OK, before I ask whether any of the panel wants to talk about Donald Trump, Tim, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you this question about the opposition. I'm going to slightly reimagine it. What do Labour need to do to be ready for government? What are the sort of key issues? And also, we have got a question from George Charles that says, do the panel think that a prospective Labour government would have clear enough plans for government upon taking power, or is it defining itself too much in purely anti-conservative terms? I think we could take the first part of that question about what you might need to do in terms of policy developments. So testing you on the recent paper that I wrote.
I was going to say that I haven't properly read recently, but that's fine. So I think what Labour need to do for government is know what they sort of broad picture want to achieve, but what we always say is there is a danger in over-preparing. So, and trying to hit the ground running too quickly and having a very fixed view of what it is that you want to do rather than what you want to achieve. And I think we've heard it from the panels earlier that Labour, they've got broad policy offers, and if you want to, they've got lots of detail on their website that you can read through. But the key thing that they are bearing in mind is that they haven't seen all of the detail, right? So I think it was Kwasi Kwarteng talked about every opposition says, well, we'll look at the books if and when we get into government. They will want to see what is actually happening inside government before they make firm decisions, rather than committing beforehand to saying, this is what we are going to do. And we can talk about case studies of when things have gone wrong, when an incoming minister has been very fixed in their view of what it is they want to the way they want to approach something. So universal credit under Ian Duncan-Smith is a good example of that. In terms of what they actually need to do now, I think they've got, 9, maybe 12 months until the election. It's continuing to build the relationships with the key groups that they want outside government. We know access talks have officially been sanctioned and maybe starting in the coming weeks. So using that, the senior members of the Labour team to build relationships with senior civil servants. There may be detailed discussions about what their plans are, but the civil service can't give them advice. What they can do is use that time to actually kind of build that relationship and understand where each side is coming from. And in broad answer to David's question, I think this opposition are spending a lot of time thinking about this. In a way, I think that's partly because the polls are where they are, partly because this election has been expected for a long time in a way that the last couple weren't. And also perhaps because of the nature of the front bench, there are a few, not many, but a few people who were in the cabinet under the last Labour government and a few more who were ministers. And so there is that more sort of deeper experience perhaps of government than there was under the last set of oppositions. I'm going to also quickly answer or have a go at the Trump question, which is just to say I was in the Treasury when Donald Trump was elected last time. And that was obviously 6 months after the referendum result. So the Treasury at that point was kind of geared up for unexpected overnight election results or difficult overnight election results. And I think since 2016, and there are many faults with this, but the UK civil service, if we're talking about that aspect of government being prepared for a Trump presidency, is used to dealing with crises, is used to dealing with unexpected events. And so that kind of muscle is well exercised. That cuts both ways because it means they are sort of often in fight or flight mode and reactive mode and not able to do the long-term strategy thinking that everyone in this building cares about. But I think there are a lot of people who have been around this once already, and they will have a sense of what they're going to be, what they'll be doing about it.
All right, brilliant, thank you. Another question online, Akash, I'm afraid it's for you. Sarah Elias, on the back of the recent review of the constitutional future for Wales, which I think you know about, what do you think? Do you think any parties have a vision for the relationship between the devolved nations and UK government, and what steps need to take place to move towards that vision? But remember, we've only got 10 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I might answer that linking actually to the conversation we were just having about specifically Labour's readiness in terms of having an agenda for what it will do. And because it's an interesting comparison to be made, I think, with 97, when constitutional reform more generally, but including very much devolution, was a huge part of the first term under Blair, and in particular the first couple of years. And they were able to move very fast on that stuff because they did have a very well-developed set of proposals. There was the Scottish Constitutional Convention, that had sort of developed a blueprint. There were plans for Wales, for regional development agencies, London governance, and so on. And that whole agenda was, maybe not all the details, but it was sort of there, ready for Labour to, even to some extent, despite Tony Blair not being personally that enthusiastic about it, but it was there on the blocks for Labour to run with very early on after May 97. They're clearly not at that point yet. I mean, we've had the Brown Commission.
Yep.
We've had, yes, the Welsh Commission last week, cross-party support, calls for further devolution and other reforms to entrench and protect Welsh devolution and that kind of stuff. But is UK Labour Party committed to either of those sets of proposals? Not clear at this point. I mean, already the Shadow Secretary for Wales seemed to rule out some elements of the Welsh Commission report, devolution of policing, for example. So I think they're still working it out, frankly, generally on devolution and constitutional change, what their agenda is going to be. And, we'll have there's other proposals, no doubt, that, metro mayors will be coming forward with the extra powers they'd like to get. But yeah, I think there's still, Labour at the national level has still a bit of work to do to get from where we are now to a clear agenda.
Yeah. Gill, you wanted to come in on Trump.
Yeah, I just want to say something very quick about Trump. Tim, I'm sure is right. The Treasury, the Bank of England do sort of have form of practicing for that. But I think it's really interesting what sort of thinking is going on in governments, and governments not just here but across Europe, about the implications of Trump, particularly if Trump does something which suggests that he's not committed to NATO, fallout of that potentially for Ukraine. And I think one of the really interesting questions, particularly if we have a sort of new or changed government with less experienced people in critical positions, is their ability to actually be thinking and partnering with people in the West on how to react to Trump. I think in the longer run, a sort of Trump presidency may cause some sort of reappraisal of the UK-EU relationship and may actually cause Europe to rethink whether it really wants to keep the UK as a really important security partner at quite the distance that was implied through the Trade and Cooperation Agreement as agreed. We already think that, one of the things on a sort of Labour agenda will be adding a security foreign policy dimension to the deal agreed by Boris Johnson and David Frost. But do they really want to actually rethink some of the other things that Labour have said they would quite like to rethink without forcing the UK to do what everybody's ruling out, which is joining the single market and the customs union? So I think it's really sort of interesting things going on there. I think that's sort of probably the only thing that might cause Europe to start thinking a bit more strategically about where does it want its long-term relationship to be with one of the very big security players on the continent, if Europe has to pick up and fill a security void left by a Trump accession.
Matthew, I've been leaving you hanging, but I've got a great question online from Charlie Grady-Pierce, who asks, what are the panel's views on what a potential incoming Labour government would focus on in respect of regulators and regulation? Right. Which I feel you're well placed to
Which of your friends did you ask to put that question?
I think it's an interesting question for an incoming government because, as we've seen in the course of the day, there's a lot of expectation and potential ambition around what the government can do, but not a lot of money to do it with. And so regulation is potentially a lever that is available to an incoming government that they can pull to try and do things that they want to do. So how do they influence behaviour, influence the private sector without having to spend money? I think they'll need to think very carefully about the way in which they do that and the extent to which they do that. And they'll need to think carefully as well about the extent of responsibility that is put onto regulators in the process of making those decisions. I mean, some of the controversies that we've seen over the last year or two, post-Brexit really, around the accountability of regulators and the extent to which the degree of autonomy that they have is going beyond what the UK Parliament, for instance, might want, which is an area of research that we're getting into at the moment, leads you to think, well, how far would you want regulators to be making those decisions independently of ministers, and what exactly would you want them to do? And this is going to arise in a whole range of areas where we're trying to enforce across education, across skills, and making trade-offs between, for instance, net zero, which we discussed earlier, energy bills, and security of supply, for instance, in the utility space. And how do we want those trade-offs to be made, and to what extent is that for regulators to do rather than for ministers or government to make those decisions. So I think an incoming government will have to think about what its position is on that, the extent of delegation it's happy to live with, and it will have to think about the extent to which it thinks regulation is a policy tool.
Thank you. And there's a good question online, which I'm actually going to throw forward to shortly our podcast, our live podcast from John Davies, who says, unless I missed it, little discussion today on migration, immigration. Does that mean panellists don't see it as a major election issue, policy challenge? I think the reality is we do. But Hannah, as podcast host, I'm going to leave that one with you. Final question then for all of the panel. I just want the month. When do you think the election's going to be?
So, November.
I've always said January, so I'm going to stick with January.
I went with October in the sweepstake, and I'm slightly regretting thinking November might have been better, but...
I went for November 21st, and I'll stick with that.
December, then.
Fine, no one go for May. That's it. Please do stay seated and stay tuned in. We will seamlessly be joined by our director, Hannah White, in a moment for her concluding remarks. But as she joins the stage, please do join me in thanking our excellent panel.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. I think we billed that as the IfG essential briefing, and I hope you'll all agree it was exactly that. So much to take away from what you've all just been saying. Obviously, lots of topics we haven't had time to cover today, but so many that we have. And I think threading through it all, as we would always expect at the IfG, the importance of making our government as effective as it can possibly be to tackle all the challenges that we've been discussing. It really has been at the forefront of the different sessions we've had today. The remarks we heard from John Glenn, his speech on the reforms he thinks he needs, the civil service needs. Quite a fiery discussion on public service performance with Kwasi Kwarteng, Georgia Gold, and our last-minute stand-in, Adam Bolton. Thank you, Adam, again, for joining us on that panel. And Karen Smith, again, standing in for Wes Streeting, setting out how the Labour government would, if they came to power, try to improve the NHS. So it really has been a very thought-provoking day ahead of what I think is going to be, we can all agree, a huge year for British politics. And delighted also to see presentation of our two of our major annual reports that we produce at the Institute, our performance track on public services and our Whitehall Monitor out today. Remember, you can head to our website to read those in more detail. I'm sure you'll want to. And while you're there, do sign up for our newsletter so you can stay in touch with everything that we do. You're all quite a select audience, so you're probably all signed up anyway. But if you happen not to, and also do consider subscribing to our two podcasts, one of which will be recorded live in a moment. That is our special event we still have to come today. Live recording of The Expert Factor, which is our I keep saying it's a new podcast. It's not that new any longer, but which we record with Paul Johnson from the IFS and Anne Menon from UK and a Changing Europe. So do stick around for that. But for now, I just want to thank all our brilliant speakers, without whom we couldn't have run the conference today. To thank you, our audience here, and also at home, everyone who's asked and sent in such good questions. I want to thank my amazing team here at the IfG, all of those who've shared their expertise and spoken on panels, but also the brilliant team who work away behind the scenes, putting the whole day together, and we couldn't have done it without you all. And finally, thank you to our partners, Grant Thornton, who helped turn the idea of today into a reality. So will you join me all in thanking all those people?